The silence of the night shattered when the Underworld Mafia stormed Victor Knight's mansion, their footsteps echoing through the halls of his fortress. Armed and dangerous, they demanded everything he owned: the money, the power, the life he'd carefully built. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Victor wasn't just a billionaire CEO. His past was a deadly secret, buried beneath layers of wealth and success. As they ransacked his home, the Mafia realized too late. They had walked into a nightmare. Victor wasn't just a target. He was a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Before we dive into this wild ride, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss a single moment of this thrilling tale, where power, danger, and secrets collide. Stay tuned for a story full of twists, betrayal, and unimaginable surprises. Victor Knight had always been a man of power. At 38, he had it all: money, status, and an empire that spanned continents. The CEO of Knight Enterprises, he was known for his sharp mind and ruthless business tactics. His mansion, perched high in the hills, was a testament to his success, with its panoramic views and modern architecture that screamed luxury. To the world, he was the perfect billionaire, untouchable, admired, feared. But behind the polished exterior lay a man tormented by a past he could never outrun. Victor had been born into wealth, but his upbringing wasn't the fairy tale it appeared to be. His father, a notorious businessman with connections to the criminal underworld, had set the foundation for Victor's empire, not with ethical deals or hard work, but through violence, manipulation, and treachery. Victor had learned early that power wasn't given, it was taken, often through blood. In his youth, Victor had embraced this darker side of his family legacy. He had made alliances with dangerous people, used his charm to deceive, and silenced those who stood in his way. But as he grew older, he began to bury the person he used to be. The mansion, the wealth, the public image, they were all a mask he wore to escape the guilt that haunted him. He severed ties with his past, cut off old associates, and built a reputation as a legitimate businessman. But it was all an illusion. Deep inside, Victor knew that no amount of money or success could wash away the blood on his hands. His past wasn't just a story, it was a living, breathing thing, lurking in the shadows, waiting to resurface. And now, it was about to come crashing down on him. It was supposed to be just another night in his gilded cage. Victor Knight, alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury and silence. The weight of the day had worn him thin, and as he sat in his study, gazing out over the city lights, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. But that peace was shattered when the first sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. His phone buzzed urgently on the desk. A flood of notifications flooded in from the security system, each one more alarming than the last. Panic surged through him as he swiped the screen. The mansion's high-tech defenses had been breached. There was no way in or out. Within minutes, the doors were kicked open by masked figures, armed, cold, and deadly. The Mafia had come for him. He recognized the men immediately. Not just low-level thugs, but leaders of a notorious crime syndicate from his past. The same people he'd hoped to leave behind forever. They knew about his father's ties, about his family's legacy, and now they were here to collect their due. Victor's heart raced as the Mafia stormed through his home, demanding control over everything. The tension in the air was thick with danger, but there was something deeper at play. Victor knew this wasn't just a robbery. This was personal. As the Mafia took over, forcing him to kneel at gunpoint, the memories of his darker years came flooding back. The deals, the betrayals, the lives he had destroyed. He had tried to outrun this moment, but now it had caught up with him. And this time, there was no escape. The Mafia's presence in his mansion felt suffocating, like a storm that had just begun to unleash its fury. Victor could feel the weight of every step they took as they moved through the halls. searching for what they came for. His wealth, his empire, they didn't care about the money. This wasn't a robbery for riches. This was payback. Victor stood frozen, watching as they ransacked his office, breaking through secured files and cabinets, searching for any trace of what they were really after. The leader of the group, a man named Marco, stood in front of him, his cold eyes scanning Victor's every move. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Marco's voice was low and menacing. Victor remained silent, unsure of how much Marco knew or how much of his past had been exposed. "I should have known you'd hide behind all this," Marco continued, motioning toward the opulence surrounding them. "But there's no escaping what you've done, Victor. Your father's debts. They don't disappear just because you've built yourself a new life. You thought you could bury it all. Your legacy, your blood-stained past. But it's all coming back." Victor's mind raced, his stomach tightening. He had buried his past so deep, had worked so hard to erase every trace of it. But now it was resurfacing. The ghosts were back, and they were demanding payment. The memories hit him like a tidal wave. Long nights in smoke-filled rooms, whispered deals, lives taken without remorse. His father had been ruthless, and Victor had been his heir, learning the ropes of power through manipulation and blood. He had watched men get shot, women disappear, and children grow up with no parents, all in the name of business. Victor hadn't just inherited wealth, he had inherited violence, a cycle that never seemed to end. Marco's words gnawed at him, his past crashing into the present with a vengeance. It was no longer about the Mafia wanting revenge. It was about Victor facing the consequences of everything he had done. All those years of running, of pretending to be someone he wasn't, had led him to this moment. And now, the very people he thought he'd escaped were standing in his mansion, demanding what was owed. "I've done nothing wrong," Victor finally spoke, his voice shaky but determined. "I've changed. I've built this life. I'm not the same man I was." Marco's lips curled into a bitter smile. "That's the lie you tell yourself every night when you go to sleep. But it's not true. You can't erase the blood on your hands, no matter how many zeros you add to your bank account." Victor's heart pounded as the words sank in. He had spent years convincing himself that he had outrun his demons, that he could control his destiny. But this was proof that his past had always been a shadow, just waiting to catch up. No matter how high he built his walls, no matter how far he ran, the Mafia had always known where to find him. As Marco paced in front of him, Victor's thoughts grew clearer. There was no escaping this. He wasn't just fighting for his wealth or his freedom, he was fighting for his soul. The choices he had made, the people he had betrayed, all of it was coming back. And now, he had to face it. Marco's hand hovered over the gun at his waist. "You think you're in control, Victor? You think you can hide behind your fancy suit and your mansion? No, you've lost control. It's time to pay up." Victor's breath caught in his throat. The Mafia weren't just here to take his money. They were here to expose him, to drag him back into the life he'd tried so hard to escape. The weight of his past was heavier than ever, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that there was no running from it anymore. Victor's heart hammered in his chest as Marco's voice echoed in the tense air. Every word, every accusation cut through him like a knife. He had spent years building this life, this perfect, polished version of himself. But it was all crumbling now, shattered by the very people he'd hoped to escape forever. Marco stepped closer, the weight of his presence suffocating. "You think you can hide behind all this? Your money? Your name? Your fancy mansion?" He chuckled darkly. "It doesn't matter how far you run, Victor. The past always catches up." Victor clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. He couldn't let this break him. He had to stay in control. He was still the billionaire, still the man with power. The Mafia might have come for him, but he wasn't about to let them win. "Not like this. You don't know anything about me," Victor spat. his voice laced with anger. His pride flared, and for a moment he felt that old rush, the arrogance, the belief that he was untouchable. I'm not that man anymore. I've built something better. I don't answer to anyone. Marco's expression darkened. You're still that same man, Victor. The man who turned his back on everyone left a trail of destruction behind. The only thing that's changed is the mask you wear. But underneath, you're still the same. Victor's mind raced. His past was a blur of darkness, criminal deals, broken alliances, and lies. But he had buried it, erased it with money and power. And for a moment, he believed it was gone. But Marco's words hit harder than any bullet. There was no escaping it. Not anymore. I did what I had to do to survive, Victor said, his voice shaking slightly. I had no choice. Everyone always says that, Marco replied, his eyes narrowing. But the truth is, you chose this. You chose the easy path, the power, the money. But now, it's all come full circle, hasn't it? Victor looked around the room. His once perfect sanctuary, now a prison. His empire, his wealth. It all seemed so hollow in that moment. His past had come alive, demanding payment for everything he'd done, for all the people he'd hurt, the lives he'd ruined. He took a deep breath, the weight of his actions settling on him. There was no more running, no more pretending. The consequences were here, staring him in the face. I can't change what I did, Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not that man who hurt people. I'm not him, and I never want to be again. For the first time, Marco paused, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was thick, charged with the unsaid, Victor's past, Marco's revenge, the unspoken truth of who Victor had once been. The Mafia had come for Victor Knight, but it wasn't just about money or power. It was about revenge for the darkness he'd unleashed, the price of his own choices. And now, as the weight of his actions bore down on him, Victor realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for his very soul. Victor stood alone in the aftermath, the silence of the mansion deafening. The Mafia had left, taking with them the remnants of his empire, but the real damage wasn't physical. It was something far deeper. His heart still raced, his mind a whirlwind of chaos. He had faced them, those ghosts of his past. But the weight of what had just happened left him feeling smaller than ever. As the adrenaline ebbed away, Victor sank into the cold leather of his chair, staring at the walls that once made him feel invincible. The past hour felt like a blur, a twisted, nightmarish replay of all his mistakes. Marco's words echoed in his ears. You think you're in control, Victor? You're still the same man. The truth stung more than he wanted to admit. No matter how hard he tried to build a new life, no matter how much wealth he acquired, no matter how far he buried the dark parts of his past, it was all still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. And it had, in the most brutal way possible. Victor ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spiraling. How had he gotten here? He had everything, wealth, power, status. Yet he was surrounded by emptiness, a cold void that money couldn't fill. The people he had wronged, the trust he had shattered. It haunted him. He'd built his fortune on the broken backs of those he had betrayed, using his charm and ruthlessness to climb to the top. But in the end, all of it felt meaningless. He had bought everything but redemption. What good was his mansion when it had been taken from him in an instant? What good was his power when it didn't protect him from his own mistakes? For the first time in his life, Victor felt truly powerless. He couldn't buy his way out of this, couldn't manipulate the truth to fit his narrative. His past was here, alive and raw, demanding he face the consequences of every decision he had made. As he sat there, buried in his thoughts, the guilt weighed heavier on him. He thought about his father, the man who had paved the way for Victor's success, The same man whose decisions had led to a blood-soaked legacy that Victor had tried to bury. But no matter how much he built, no matter how much money he made, Victor was still his father's son. He couldn't outrun it. How many lives had I ruined? Victor asked himself. How many people had I stepped on to get to the top? The realization came crashing down on him. His success had been built on manipulation, on lies. He had treated people as commodities, as pawns in a game he always thought he controlled. The people who had trusted him, the ones he had used, his employees, his business partners, even those he claimed to love, none of them had been real to him. They were just tools for him to use. Victor's breath hitched as he thought of his staff, the ones who had worked for him day in and day out, never knowing the man he truly was. They saw the version of him he wanted them to see, the kind, charismatic billionaire CEO. But that man didn't exist. Not really. And deep down, Victor knew it. He had fooled them all. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, feeling the weight of his own betrayal. The road ahead was clear now, though he had never felt so lost. He needed to change, but the thought terrified him. Could he really change after everything he'd done? Was there any hope left for someone like him? Victor glanced out the window at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world that kept spinning, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded in his life. But he wasn't the same man anymore. He couldn't continue down this path. It wasn't just about saving his wealth or his reputation. It was about saving himself. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. It wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, he could start over. But first, he had to face the hardest truth of all. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. And for the first time, he was ready to make amends. It was a long road ahead. But it had to start with him. Victor Knight, not the billionaire, but the man who had finally decided to own up to his past. Weeks passed since the Mafia's intrusion, but for Victor, the time felt like an eternity. The scars left by the confrontation weren't just physical. They were etched deep within him. The walls of his mansion felt colder than ever, as though they, too, were closing in on him. But the emptiness he once felt, an emptiness filled with wealth and power, had shifted. It was now filled with a sense of urgency, a need for change. Victor had spent years building his empire, but in the process, he had neglected something far more important: the people around him. He had treated them as tools, as means to an end. But now, he was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his actions. It started with the small things. He stopped barking orders at his staff, no longer treating them like subordinates, but as human beings with lives and stories of their own. He began saying please and thank you, words he had once thought were beneath him. For the first time in years, he found himself listening rather than speaking, genuinely interested in the lives of the people who had worked for him all these years. But the real change began with Jasmine. She had been working as his head housekeeper for the past few months. But in all that time, Victor had never really taken the time to understand her. He had always seen her as just another employee, someone who was there to keep his mansion running smoothly. But now, as he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized how much he had missed. Jasmine had been a steady presence in his home, always professional, always kind, but always distant. Victor had admired her work ethic, her attention to detail, but it was only now, after the confrontation, that he began to see the depth of her character. She wasn't like the others. She didn't want his money or his power. She didn't care about his wealth. In fact, she seemed to regard it with indifference. It was almost like she saw through the mask he had worn for so long, and it left him feeling exposed in a way he couldn't ignore. One evening, as Victor walked through the mansion, he saw Jasmine working in the kitchen, her head bent over a bowl as she prepared dinner. Her presence was calming, steady, and for the first time, He felt the weight of his loneliness. He stood in the doorway, watching her without saying a word. Jasmine looked up, her face lighting up with a genuine smile when she saw him. "You're home early," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Victor nodded, stepping into the room. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." She raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. Victor hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. He had never been one to open up, never one to admit weakness, but he had to try. For the first time, he didn't feel like he needed to maintain his facade. "I've been a terrible person," he confessed, his voice low. "I've spent my entire life chasing power, building an empire. But I've neglected the people who mattered. You've been right here, working beside me, and I never truly saw you. I never understood you." Jasmine watched him carefully, her expression softening. "You're right," she said quietly. "But that's not my place to judge. We all have our own paths to walk." Victor's heart clenched at her words. He wasn't used to people forgiving him, let alone offering him understanding. "I've hurt so many people," he admitted. "I've been so consumed by my past, my legacy, that I never stopped to think about the people I've hurt along the way. And now, I see the damage I've done." Jasmine was silent for a moment, then stepped closer to him. She had always kept her distance, professional, guarded. But now there was something different in her eyes, an unspoken understanding. "You can't change the past," she said softly, "but you can choose to do better. It starts with how you treat the people around you." Victor looked at her, and for the first time he saw her clearly, not as an employee, but as someone who had been quietly observing his transformation, waiting for him to see the truth. He had been so blind to the people around him, so focused on himself. But Jasmine was different. She didn't want anything from him. She wasn't interested in his wealth or power. She had something deeper, something Victor realized he wanted: authenticity, humility, and connection. Over the next few weeks, Victor continued to change. He reached out to the people he had once alienated: old friends, former business partners, and even employees who had left Knight Enterprises years ago. He apologized, offered help where he could, and started rebuilding the relationships he had torn apart in his pursuit of success. But with Jasmine, the change was more gradual, more personal. Victor began leaving small notes for her. Nothing extravagant, just simple thank yous for the work she did. He would find her during breaks and ask her about her day, her thoughts, her life outside the mansion. Slowly, the coldness that had once existed between them began to thaw. She began to smile more around him, and when their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding that had been absent before. One evening, as they shared a quiet moment in the garden after dinner, Victor turned to her. "Jasmine, I don't expect anything from you," he said softly, his voice sincere. "But I'd like to be someone you can trust. I want to be the kind of man who earns that trust, day by day." She looked at him, and for a moment, Victor saw something in her eyes, something warm, something that spoke of hope. "I think you're already on your way," she said, her voice steady. And for the first time in his life, Victor believed it. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Months had passed since the Mafia's intrusion, and though the physical scars had long healed, Victor Knight had transformed in ways no one had expected. Especially not him. The billionaire who had once built his life on power, control, and manipulation had become someone entirely different. Someone trying to redeem himself. Victor's journey was not easy. Each step toward change had been a struggle. He had spent years building his empire, but what he realized in the aftermath of the Mafia attack was that none of it mattered if he couldn't be true to himself and the people who mattered most. The people he had hurt. The people like Jasmine. Jasmine had been his steadfast presence through the chaos. She had seen the worst sides of him, the arrogant, self-centered billionaire, And yet, she had never judged him. She had simply been there, working, helping, giving her best to a man who barely noticed her. She had been quiet, professional, but over time, he had come to admire her strength, her patience, and her grace. He had come to see her not just as an employee, but as someone he deeply respected, and perhaps someone he could never have imagined needing until it was almost too late. Victor knew he had to make things right, but he also knew that this couldn't be done through words or gestures that had worked for him in the past. No amount of expensive gifts or flashy displays could undo the damage he had done. The only thing that could prove his sincerity, his transformation, was action. It was a crisp autumn evening when Victor decided to act. The garden at his mansion, once a place of solitude, now felt like the setting for a new chapter, one he was ready to write, not just for himself, but for Jasmine. He had spent days planning, reflecting on his journey, and thinking about how to show her that the man he had been was gone. He was no longer that man who used power and wealth to manipulate people. He was a man willing to be vulnerable, to expose the rawness of who he was, in hopes that she would see the sincerity behind it. He waited for her that evening, his heart pounding in his chest. Jasmine had been working late, preparing for the final touches on dinner, and Victor knew that tonight he had to say the words that had been sitting in the depths of his soul for far too long. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Victor stood at the edge of the garden, his mind racing with thoughts of what to say, how to say it. When Jasmine walked into the garden, her presence illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. She was standing there, her eyes bright, her smile warm, yet there was still that distance between them, a distance that he knew he had to cross. "Jasmine," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. She looked up, startled, then smiled softly as she approached. "Victor?" she replied, her tone gentle, though he could see the curiosity in her eyes. "What's going on?" Victor took a deep breath, stepping forward and placing a small box in her hands. Her eyes widened as she looked at it, her fingers tracing the elegant design. But he wasn't asking her to open it. He wasn't asking for a superficial gesture. This wasn't about a ring, a gift, or something he could buy. It was about showing her that he had learned to love with honesty and humility. "I've spent my life building things," Victor began, his voice filled with raw emotion, "but none of it has mattered. Not the wealth, not the power. None of it means anything if I can't be true to myself and to the people I've hurt. To you, Jasmine, you've been here through it all, silently observing my transformation, never asking for anything. And yet, you've been the one constant in my life." Jasmine stared at him, her expression unreadable. The distance between them seemed to have shrunk, but the silence stretched long, almost unbearable. Victor reached out and gently took her hand, his touch tentative but filled with an unspoken promise. "I've been selfish. I've been blind. But what I've learned is that love isn't something you manipulate or control. It's something you nurture, something you earn. And you, Jasmine, you've shown me that. You've shown me what real love is: humility, respect, and trust." He paused, taking in the weight of the moment, allowing her to process his words. "I can't change the past. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can choose who I am now. And I choose to be someone who is worthy of your trust, your respect, and your love. I don't have a grand ring or an expensive gesture to offer, but I offer you this: my heart, my honesty, and my commitment to be a better man." Jasmine's eyes filled with something Victor couldn't quite name. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Victor, trembling with the intensity of the moment, continued. "Jasmine, I want to build a future with you, one that's not defined by my past, not defined by my wealth, but by the connection we create. I want to be a man who deserves you, Will you give me that chance? There it was, the vulnerability that Victor had spent so many years running from. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control the situation. He wasn't using his money or status to manipulate her into responding a certain way. He was simply offering her the truth. Jasmine remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then she smiled. A soft, genuine smile that made Victor's heart swell. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice filled with warmth. "I've always believed in second chances. And I believe in you, Victor. I believe you've changed." It wasn't the grand gesture Victor had once imagined. A proposal fit for royalty. A moment of grandiosity that would forever mark the beginning of something new. It was simpler. It was real. And it was everything he needed. Victor exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he felt truly free. Victor's journey wasn't just about defeating the Mafia or reclaiming his empire. It was about rediscovering who he was and learning the true value of love, humility, and growth. We all have our pasts, our mistakes, but the beauty of life lies in our ability to change, to make amends, and to build a future based on who we choose to be today. Victor chose redemption, and through that choice, he found not just peace, but a love he never expected. If this story resonated with you, remember, no one is beyond redemption. It's never too late to change and become the person you were meant to be. If you enjoyed this journey of transformation, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Thank you for watching, and remember, true growth begins from within.